Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're talking about Mauritius, and I'm going to lead with the thing that absolutely fascinated me when I started researching this place. There's a spot off the southwest coast where it looks like there's a massive waterfall plunging into the depths of the ocean, like a genuine underwater waterfall. Except it's not actually waterfalling, it's sand and sediment being dragged along the ocean floor by currents, creating this optical illusion that's so convincing it shows up on satellite imagery and has launched 1,000 Instagram posts. That's Mauritius for you. An island that's been fooling people since before people even lived there. We're going deep tonight, 6 full sections covering everything from volcanic beginnings to modern-day complexities, so get comfortable. Dim the lights, settle in, and if you're new here, welcome. If you're a regular, thanks for coming back. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing how far these episodes travel. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because we've got a whole world left to cover. Let's start with the land itself. Chapter 1. The island that shouldn't be there. If you pull up a map of the Indian Ocean and zoom out far enough, Mauritius starts to look like a geographical accident. It's sitting there, 900 kilometers east of Madagascar, completely alone in a vast stretch of blue water, like someone dropped a mountain range in the middle of the ocean and forgot to pick it up, which, in a sense, is exactly what happened, except instead of someone it was volcanic activity. And instead of forgetting, the volcano just went dormant and left behind roughly 2,000 square kilometers of tropical island for the rest of us to argue over. The island is old, not ancient in the way that continents are ancient, but old enough that by the time humans showed up, it had already been sitting here for 8 million years doing its thing. It formed from a hotspot in the Earth's mantle, one of those places where magma punches through the crust and builds up layer after layer of hardened lava, until eventually you've got land. The same process that gave us Hawaii, Iceland, and a dozen other places that make geologists unnervingly excited. The volcano that made Mauritius has been extinct for a long time now, which is great news if you're planning to live here. But it does mean the island has had millions of years to erode, weather, and generally settle into a shape that makes sense. And the shape it's settled into is kind of perfect, if you're into that sort of thing. The centre of the island is a plateau, averaging around 600 meters above sea level, high enough to stay cool, low enough that you're not gasping for air. The edges slope down to coastal plains that wrap around most of the island like a frame, and beyond that, you've got lagoons. Gorgeous, clear, coral-fringed lagoons that make the place look like a screensaver. The reefs form a natural barrier around nearly the entire island, which historically meant safe anchorage for ships and, more recently, means excellent snorkeling and a tourism industry that prints money. The reef system is genuinely impressive. It encircles the island like a protective wall, creating a calm lagoon environment that's perfect for marine life and equally perfect for tourists who want to swim without getting pummeled by ocean swells. Inside the lagoon, the water is shallow, warm, and so clear you can see the bottom from 20 meters away. Outside the reef, the ocean floor drops off dramatically. We're talking hundreds of meters in some places, which creates this sharp boundary between the safe, calm interior and the deep, unpredictable ocean beyond. It's the kind of natural setup that makes you understand why sailors loved this place. You could anchor in the lagoon, repair your ship, resupply, and not worry about waves smashing you against the rocks. Assuming you could find the gaps in the reef to get through in the first place, which was its own challenge. The highest point on the island is Piton de la Petite Rivière Noire, which sounds very impressive in French and translates to Peak of the Little Black River, which sounds significantly less impressive in English. It tops out at 828 meters, Not exactly Everest. You could climb it in an afternoon if you felt like it. But from up there, you get the full view, the plateau dropping away to the coast, the lagoons glowing turquoise against the darker blue of the open ocean, and if the weather's clear, the curvature of the earth reminding you just how small and isolated this place really is. The plateau itself is a patchwork of sugarcane fields, remnant forests, and volcanic rock formations that jut out at odd angles like the bones of the island pushing through. It's cooler up here than on the coast, not cold, but comfortable, and it gets more rain, which is why this is where the island's reservoirs are concentrated. The landscape has a strange otherworldly quality to it in places, especially where the volcanic origins are most obvious. You'll be walking through farmland and suddenly encounter these massive chunks of black basalt, weathered and pitted, that look like they were dropped there by something with no sense of aesthetics, which, again, is kind of what happened. Volcanism is not known for its subtlety. Now, isolation is a recurring theme in the story of Mauritius, because this island spent most of its existence completely alone. No land bridges, no nearby continents, just ocean in every direction, which means that everything living here either flew, swam, or drifted in on the wind. And the things that did make it here evolved in bizarre and wonderful directions, because they didn't have to compete with the usual cast of predators and competitors you'd find on a mainland. This is how you end up with giant tortoises, flightless birds, and forests full of ebony trees that grew so dense the wood became legendary. The most famous evolutionary experiment, of course, was the dodo. If you've heard of Mauritius at all, there's a decent chance it's because of this bird. The dodo was a large, flightless pigeon that had gotten so comfortable on an island with no predators that it basically forgot how to be afraid. It waddled around, ate fruit, nested on the ground, and lived a pretty chill existence until humans showed up in the 1600s and introduced rats, pigs, dogs, and a general philosophy of, if it moves, we should probably eat it or let our animals eat it. By 1681, the dodo was extinct, the whole species gone in less than a century. It's become the global poster child for human-caused extinction, which is deeply ironic because most people couldn't tell you a single other fact about Mauritius, but they know what a dodo looks like. Here's what makes the dodo story particularly tragic. The birds weren't even that good to eat. Multiple sailors' accounts describe the meat as tough and unappetizing. So they weren't hunted to extinction because they were delicious, they were just easy. And their eggs, laid right there on the ground with no protection, were even easier. Rats ate the eggs. Pigs ate the eggs. Dogs ate the adult birds. Humans cut down the forests where the birds nested. It was death by 1,000 cuts, except the cuts happened really fast. The last confirmed sighting was in 1662, though some reports suggest stragglers survived another couple decades. Either way, by the end of the 1600s, the dodo was a memory. And then it became a myth, and then it became a symbol, which is a hell of a legacy for a bird that just wanted to eat fruit in peace. The forests didn't fare much better. Before humans arrived, much of the island was covered in dense native vegetation, ebony, hardwoods, palms, all kinds of species that existed nowhere else on Earth. The ebony in particular was prized. The wood is dark, incredibly hard, and takes a polish like glass. It became a major export, which meant it got logged extensively, and by the time anyone thought to ask, hey, should we maybe leave some of these trees standing? It was too late. Today, native forests cover a tiny fraction of the island. Most of what you see now is secondary growth, plantations, or invasive species that moved in once the original ecosystem got dismantled. The invasive species situation is genuinely wild. Once you disrupt an isolated island ecosystem, It's like opening Pandora's box. Rats, monkeys, exotic plants, they all moved in and thrived, often at the expense of native species that had evolved without any defences against them. The Mauritius kestrel, a small falcon, was down to 4 individuals in the wild by the 1970s. 4. The entire species was functionally extinct. But then conservationists intervened with a captive breeding program, and now there are a few hundred of them flying around, which is one of the rare stories in conservation biology that doesn't end in tragedy. So that's nice. Let's talk climate. Mauritius sits in the tropics, which means it's warm year-round, but it's also an island, which means the ocean moderates everything. You've got a cooler, drier season from May to November, and a warmer, wetter season from November to May. The trade winds blow pretty much constantly, which keeps the coastal areas pleasant, and also means that if you're trying to sail here, you'd better understand wind patterns or you're going to have a bad time. Cyclones are a thing. The island sits right in the cyclone belt, and every few years a big one rolls through and reminds everyone that living on a small island in the Indian Ocean comes with certain risks. Roofs get torn off, trees get flattened, and everyone hunkers down and waits for it to pass. The cyclone season runs from November to May, overlapping neatly with the hot, humid months, which feels like nature piling on. These storms form out in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, build strength, and then sweep across the island with winds that can top 200 kilometers per hour. The island has gotten good at preparing for them early warning systems, building codes that account for high winds, evacuation procedures, but you can only do so much when you're dealing with that much atmospheric violence. After a major cyclone, the cleanup can take months. Fields get flooded, infrastructure gets damaged, and the tourism industry, which is a huge chunk of the economy, takes a hit, because nobody wants to vacation on an island that just got hammered by a storm. But the island bounces back. It always does. You don't survive 8 million years of geological history without developing some resilience. There are no natural lakes on Mauritius, which feels like an oversight given how much rain the place gets. But there are crater lakes, remnants of the island's volcanic past, and a bunch of reservoirs that were built to manage water supply and irrigation. The rivers are short and fast, running from the central plateau down to the coast, and they're prone to flash flooding during heavy rains. It's the kind of hydrology that makes sense when you remember the whole island is basically a mountain sticking out of the ocean. Water doesn't have far to travel. And then there's that underwater waterfall I mentioned at the beginning. It's off the coast of Le Morne-Brabant, on the southwestern tip of the island, and from above, whether you're in a helicopter or looking at satellite images, it genuinely looks like the ocean floor is collapsing into an abyss. What's actually happening is that sand and silt deposits are being swept off the edge of the underwater shelf by strong currents, creating this cascading visual effect. It's not real, but it's spectacular, and it's become one of those images that defines the island in the Instagram age, which is fitting, because Mauritius has always been about appearances. Beautiful on the surface, complicated underneath. Speaking of complicated, the island's position in the Indian Ocean made it valuable long before anyone lived here. It sits right on the maritime routes between Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. If you're sailing from Europe to India, or from India to the Cape of Good Hope, Mauritius is a convenient stopover. Safe harbour, fresh water, timber for repairs. It's the kind of location that colonial powers dream about, which explains why the island's history is basically a series of European flags being planted, torn down, and replaced with different European flags. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before any of that, the island just existed. Waves crashed against the reefs, cyclones swept through, the ebony forests grew thick and dark. Giant tortoises lumbered along the coast, dodos nested in the underbrush. and for millions of years no human being had any idea this place was here. It was a secret, a lush, volcanic, biologically weird secret sitting in the middle of the ocean waiting to be discovered. And when it finally was discovered, everything changed. Which is where we're headed next. Chapter 2: Discovery, Disappointment, and Ecological Disaster. So the island existed in isolation for millions of years, and then, sometime in the medieval period, people started to notice it. Not European people, they were still figuring out that the earth was round and arguing about whether sailing west would get them to India or drop them off the edge of the world. No, the first people to know about Mauritius were almost certainly Arab and Malay sailors who'd been crisscrossing the Indian Ocean for centuries, carrying spices, textiles, and rumours about distant lands. They called the island Dina Arobi, or at least that's what some historical sources suggest, though the evidence is thin and relies mostly on maps drawn centuries later by people who weren't there. What we do know is that these sailors didn't settle on Mauritius. They used it as a landmark, maybe stopped for water, and moved on, which, in retrospect, was probably the smartest thing anyone ever did with this island. The Portuguese showed up first among the Europeans, because the Portuguese showed up first everywhere in the early 1500s. They were obsessed with finding a sea route to India that didn't involve crossing Ottoman territory, and they threw ships at the problem until it worked. One of those ships, captained by a navigator named Diogo Fernandes Pereira, spotted Mauritius around 1507. He took a look, made some notes, and kept sailing, because he had actual goals that didn't involve small volcanic islands with no obvious gold deposits. The Portuguese called it Cern, which supposedly means swan, though there's some debate about whether that's a translation error or whether they genuinely thought the dodos looked like swans, which would be hilarious. A dodo looks about as much like a swan as a potato looks like a ballerina. The name didn't stick anyway. For the next 90 years, Mauritius remained essentially a rest stop. Portuguese ships would swing by, fill their water barrels, maybe cut down a few trees for ship repairs, and leave. Nobody tried to build anything permanent. Nobody planted crops. Nobody even bothered to name it properly in a way that stuck. It was just that island east of Madagascar, which is not exactly a compelling pitch for colonization. The Portuguese were busy running a maritime empire that stretched from Brazil to Macau, and they didn't have the resources or interest to waste on a place that offered nothing but trees and birds. Then the Dutch arrived, and everything went sideways. The Dutch East India Company was one of the most powerful corporations in human history, which is a weird sentence to write, but it's true. At their peak, they had their own army, their own navy, and the legal authority to negotiate treaties, wage war, and establish colonies anywhere they wanted. They were capitalism with cannons, and they wanted a piece of the Indian Ocean trade network that the Portuguese had been monopolizing. In 1598, a Dutch fleet commanded by Admiral Wybrand van Warwick stumbled across Mauritius, planted a flag, and named it after Prince Maurice of Nassau, who was the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic at the time. Maurice never visited the island. He probably never thought about it twice, but his name stuck, which is the kind of legacy you get when you're in charge during the golden age of Dutch maritime expansion. The Dutch were practical people. They weren't interested in spreading Christianity or building empires for glory. They wanted profit, and they wanted it efficiently. Mauritius looked like it might be useful. It was positioned along the route between Europe and the Spice Islands, which meant Dutch ships could stop there for repairs and supplies, instead of limping all the way to the Cape of Good Hope or pushing on to India in damaged condition. Plus, there were those ebony trees. Ebony was worth its weight in, well, not quite gold, but close. The wood was dense, dark and beautiful, and European aristocrats would pay ridiculous sums for furniture made from it. The Dutch saw trees, saw profit, and decided that was enough reason to try settling the place. The Dutch didn't settle immediately. They poked around, cut down some ebony trees, killed some dodos, because why wouldn't you kill a weird slow bird that doesn't run away, and then left? It wasn't until 1638 that they made a serious attempt at colonization, sending a group of settlers under the command of Cornelius Guyer to establish a permanent base. The plan was simple: extract valuable resources, establish a waypoint for ships travelling between Europe and the Dutch East Indies, and maybe make some money in the process. What could go wrong? Basically everything, as it turned out. The Dutch colony on Mauritius was a disaster from day one. The settlers arrived expecting to set up a profitable operation, but they immediately ran into problems. The soil on the coast wasn't great for farming. The climate was hotter and more humid than they were used to. Cyclones kept rolling through and destroying whatever they built, and the island's isolation meant that supply ships were infrequent and unreliable. So if something went wrong, and things went wrong constantly, they were on their own. The colony limped along for 20 years, survived mostly by cutting down ebony trees and shipping the timber back to Europe, where it fetched high prices as luxury furniture material. The trees were slow growing and couldn't regenerate fast enough to keep up with the logging, which meant the Dutch were essentially strip mining the forest. But that was a future problem, and the Dutch East India Company was not historically concerned with future problems. They brought slaves. This is where the labour system that would define Mauritius for the next 2 centuries began. The Dutch imported enslaved people from Madagascar and Indonesia to do the actual work of logging, building, and trying to farm in conditions that Europeans found unbearable. The slave population was small compared to what would come later under the French and British, but it established the pattern. Mauritius would be built on the backs of people who had no choice in the matter, who were brought to the island in chains and forced to work until they died or escaped. Some did escape. When the Dutch finally abandoned the island, they left behind a small population of formerly enslaved people who'd managed to slip away into the interior, and those individuals became the first truly permanent residents of Mauritius. Not because they chose to be there, but because they had nowhere else to go. These escaped slaves, often called Maroons, though the term would become more common, later lived in the forests and mountains, away from the coast where the Dutch settlements were concentrated. They hunted, foraged, and tried to stay invisible. It wasn't an easy life. The island was small enough that hiding permanently was difficult, and the Dutch periodically sent out patrols to recapture runaways. But the mountainous interior provided some protection, and over time these communities developed their own survival strategies, their own social structures. They were the first people to actually choose to live on Mauritius, as opposed to being forced there by slavery or economic necessity. That's a meaningful distinction, even if their circumstances were brutal. The dodo, meanwhile, was having a spectacularly bad century. The Dutch ate them when convenient, though. As I mentioned earlier, the meat was reportedly terrible, but the real damage came from the animals the Dutch brought with them. Pigs, rats, dogs, monkeys, all of which thrived in the absence of natural predators and proceeded to devour dodo eggs, destroy nests, and generally wreck the fragile ecosystem the dodos depended on. By 1681, the dodo was gone, extinct. The entire species wiped out in less than a century of human contact. It's one of the fastest and most complete extinctions in recorded history, and it happened because a bunch of Dutch merchants wanted cheap timber and didn't care what else got destroyed in the process. In 1658, the Dutch gave up. They abandoned the colony, declared the whole experiment a failure, and sailed away. The island sat empty for 6 years, which must have been a relief for whatever wildlife was left. but the Dutch came back in 1664, because apparently they hadn't learned their lesson the first time. This second attempt lasted longer, but was no more successful. The colony remained small, underfunded, and perpetually on the edge of collapse. Cyclones kept smashing the infrastructure. Crops failed. The ebony forests were nearly exhausted. And the slaves kept running away, which the Dutch viewed as an inexplicable betrayal rather than the predictable result of, enslaving people. By 1710, the Dutch had had enough. They packed up, burned what they didn't want to carry, released or abandoned the remaining slaves, and left Mauritius for good. Their official assessment of the island was basically not worth the trouble, which is a damning review when you're a colonial power that spent 72 years intermittently trying to make something work. They left behind an ecological catastrophe. The ebony forests were decimated. The dodo was extinct. The native ecosystem was in shambles, overrun with invasive species that would continue to spread unchecked. And scattered across the island were small groups of escaped slaves living in the interior trying to build lives out of the wreckage the Dutch had left behind. For 5 years, Mauritius was a no-man's land. Pirates may have used it as a base. There are some reports of pirate activity in the region during this period, but there was no official government, no organised settlement, just an island quietly recovering from 7 decades of exploitation. The forests started to grow back, though not with the same species that had been there before. The invasive rats, pigs and monkeys continued to thrive, and the coral lagoons at least remained beautiful, untouched by the chaos happening on land. The Dutch legacy on Mauritius is, to put it mildly, grim. They introduced slavery to the island. They drove the dodo to extinction. They destroyed the ebony forests that had stood for thousands of years. They proved that the island was habitable but didn't bother to build anything that would last. When they left, they abandoned everything they'd started and left the island in worse shape than they'd found it. Which is impressive, in a horrifying way. It takes a certain kind of dedication to spend 70 years somewhere and leave it objectively worse off. But the Dutch period did establish a few things that would matter later. It proved that Mauritius could support a colony, even if that colony was miserable and unprofitable. It demonstrated that the island's strategic location in the Indian Ocean made it valuable as a naval base and supply station. And it showed that sugarcane, which the Dutch had planted in small experimental plots, could grow here, though they never developed it into a major crop. All of these lessons would be absorbed by the next colonial power to take an interest in the island. And that power was already circling. The French had been watching the Dutch struggle with Mauritius for decades, and they'd noticed something the Dutch had missed. The island's potential wasn't in ebony or dodos or experimental farming. It was in sugar. Sugar was the most valuable commodity in the Atlantic world, and the French had just figured out that the tropical climate of the Indian Ocean islands was perfect for growing it. They had ambitions. They had resources, and unlike the Dutch, they had a plan. In 1715, the French arrived. They renamed the island Isle de France, and they turned it into something the Dutch never could have imagined. Which is where things get really interesting. Chapter 3: Sugar, Slavery, and the Transformation of Isle de France. The French didn't waste time. In 1715, a captain named Guillaume Dufresne d'Arcel sailed into the harbour the Dutch had abandoned, planted a French flag, and declared the island the property of King Louis XV. He renamed it Ile de France, which sounds romantic until you remember that basically everything French was called de France at some point, so the name was more bureaucratic convenience than poetic inspiration. But it stuck. For the next 95 years, This would be Isle de France, a jewel in the crown of French colonial ambitions in the Indian Ocean, or at least that's how the French saw it. The enslaved people who would be forced to build that jewel probably had a different perspective. The early years of French colonization were not impressive. Just like the Dutch before them, the first French settlers struggled with the climate, the cyclones, and the general difficulty of trying to establish a European-style society on a tropical island that had no interest in cooperating. The French East India Company ran the show, and they were learning the same lessons the Dutch had learned the hard way. You can't just show up, plant a flag, and expect profits to materialize. You need infrastructure, you need a functioning port, you need roads, hospitals, administrative buildings, and a labour force willing or forced to do the actual work. For the first 20 years, the French colony was barely more successful than the Dutch one had been. And then, in 1735, a man named Bertrand François Mahé de Labourdonnais arrived as governor, and everything changed. Labourdonnais is one of those historical figures who shows up, completely transforms a place, and then gets recalled to France and largely forgotten by everyone except historians. But while he was governor of Isle de France, from 1735 to 1746, he turned the island from a struggling outpost into a legitimate colonial enterprise. He built Port Louis from scratch, transforming what had been a small anchorage into a proper deep-water harbour capable of handling naval and merchant vessels. He constructed a shipyard, because if you're going to control Indian Ocean trade routes, you need to be able to repair and build ships locally. He established roads connecting the interior plantations to the coast. He built a hospital, government buildings, warehouses, and fortifications. He brought in engineers, craftsmen, and thousands of enslaved labourers to do the construction work. The scale of Labourdonnais' building programme was remarkable, especially given the island's isolation and limited resources. Everything had to be planned meticulously. Timber for construction came from the remaining forests. Stone was quarried from the volcanic rock. Coral was harvested from the reefs to make lime for mortar. And all of this work was done by enslaved people who had no choice in the matter and received no compensation beyond the bare minimum needed to keep them alive and working. Labourdonnais gets credit in the history books for developing the island, but the actual development was done by thousands of people whose names we'll never know, under conditions we can barely imagine. Most importantly, Labourdonnais understood something the Dutch never quite grasped. The island's real value wasn't in timber, it was in sugar. Sugar was the most profitable commodity in the world at this point. European demand was insatiable. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean were making obscene amounts of money, and the French wanted in on that action. Isle de France had the right climate, the right soil conditions, and the right strategic location to become a major sugar producer. The only problem was that growing sugar required massive amounts of labour, and labour in the tropics meant enslaved people. Labourdonnais understood this calculation perfectly. He didn't invent slavery on the island, the Dutch had already done that, but he industrialized it. He oversaw the importation of thousands of enslaved Africans and Malagasy people, and he organized them into a plantation economy that would define Isle de France for the next century and a half. By the 1770s, sugar was king. The island had dozens of plantations, each one a self-contained world of forced labour and export-driven agriculture. The enslaved population exploded. In 1777, there were roughly 25,000 enslaved people on the island compared to about 6,000 free people. That's a ratio of more than 4-to-1, which is the kind of demographic imbalance that keeps colonial administrators awake at night. Because the obvious question is, what happens if they all decide to revolt at once? The answer, from the planters' perspective, was to make sure that never happened, which meant brutal discipline, constant surveillance, and a legal system designed to keep enslaved people powerless. The French had a set of laws called the Code Noir, the Black Code, which theoretically regulated slavery and placed some limits on how enslaved people could be treated. In practice, the Code Noir was largely ignored. It said, for instance, that enslaved people couldn't be worked on Sundays, that they had to be fed and clothed adequately, and that torture was prohibited. But enforcement was essentially non-existent, because the people doing the enslaving were also the people in charge of enforcing the laws. Plantation owners had near absolute authority over the people they enslaved, and the colonial government looked the other way as long as the sugar kept flowing and the profits kept growing. The Code Noir existed mostly as legal window dressing, a way for French authorities to claim they'd impose civilized standards on an inherently uncivilized system. Life on a sugar plantation was brutal. You woke up before dawn, worked in the fields until midday heat, made it dangerous to continue, rested briefly, and then worked until sunset. During harvest season, the work didn't stop. Sugarcane has to be processed quickly after it's cut, or it spoils, which meant the mills ran day and night, and enslaved people worked in rotating shifts, sometimes for 18 or 20 hours straight. The work was back-breaking. The conditions were dangerous. Accidents with machetes and mill machinery were common. Disease was rampant in the crowded slave quarters, and the punishments for resistance or disobedience ranged from whipping to mutilation to execution. Unsurprisingly, people resisted. Some escaped to the mountains and joined the maroon communities that had been growing since the Dutch period. These communities were small but persistent, hiding in the rugged interior where colonial authorities had difficulty reaching them. The Maroons lived by hunting, subsistence farming, and occasionally raiding plantations for supplies. They were a constant thorn in the side of the colonial government, both because they represented lost labour and because they offered hope to enslaved people still on the plantations. If you could make it to the mountains, you had a chance at freedom. Not a great chance. Maroon life was hard, and recapture meant severe punishment or death, but a chance nonetheless. There were also occasional revolts. Nothing on the scale of the Haitian Revolution, which would explode a few decades later and terrify slaveholding societies across the Atlantic world, but periodic uprisings where groups of enslaved people tried to seize their freedom by force. These revolts were invariably crushed with overwhelming violence, and the ringleaders were executed publicly as a warning to everyone else. The message was clear: resistance might be possible, but it wouldn't be tolerated, and the consequences would be horrific. Meanwhile, Port Louis was thriving. Labourdonnais' vision had turned the city into a bustling colonial capital. Ships from France, India, China, and East Africa crowded the harbour. Warehouses lined the docks, filled with sugar, spices, textiles, and all the other goods that fueled the Indian Ocean trade. The city had theatres, churches, markets, and a social scene that tried very hard to recreate French aristocratic life in a tropical setting, complete with fancy balls, elaborate dinners, and a rigid social hierarchy that everyone pretended was natural and inevitable. At the top of that hierarchy were the grands blancs, the wealthy plantation owners and high-ranking colonial officials who controlled the island's economy and politics. Below them were the petits blancs, poor white colonists who did skilled labour or worked as overseers and shopkeepers. Below them were the gens de couleur libre, free people of colour who occupied a strange and precarious position in the social order. Many of them were the mixed-race children of white planters and enslaved women, freed by their fathers but never fully accepted into white society. They could own property, run businesses, and sometimes even own slaves themselves, but they faced constant discrimination and legal restrictions. And at the bottom, of course, were the enslaved people who made the whole system function. The island's strategic importance grew alongside its economic value. Isle de France wasn't just a sugar producer, it was also a naval base. The French used Port Louis as a staging ground for military operations across the Indian Ocean, and during conflicts with Britain, the island became a haven for French privateers. These corsairs, as they were called, were essentially government-sanctioned pirates who raided British merchant ships, seized their cargo, and brought it back to Isle de France to be sold. The most famous of these corsairs was Robert Surcouf, who became a legend for his daring attacks on British vessels and his ability to outmaneuver the Royal Navy. The British hated him, the French loved him, and the enslaved people loading and unloading his captured ships probably didn't care one way or the other, because their lives didn't change regardless of which European power was winning. By the late 1700s, Isle de France was a thriving, brutal, deeply unequal society held together by violence and systematic economic exploitation. The sugar economy was booming. Port Louis was wealthy and cosmopolitan. The French planters lived in luxury, convinced that they'd created a tropical paradise. And beneath all of it, tens of thousands of enslaved people endured conditions that were, by any measure, horrific. But the French were also starting to realize they had a problem. The island's success had made it a target. The British, who controlled India and much of the Indian Ocean trade network, were getting increasingly annoyed by the French presence on Isle de France. The privateering operations were cutting into British profits. The island's strategic location allowed France to project naval power in a region Britain considered its own. And with the Napoleonic Wars ramping up in Europe, it was only a matter of time before those conflicts spilled over into the Indian Ocean. The French tried to fortify the island. They built coastal batteries, strengthened the defences around Port Louis, and stationed more troops. But they were fighting against geography. Isle de France was isolated, thousands of kilometres from France, and resupplying it during wartime was nearly impossible. The British, on the other hand, had India as a nearby base of operations, with all the resources and manpower that implied. The math wasn't in France's favour, and the enslaved population was growing increasingly restless. News travelled even to remote islands. Word of the French Revolution had reached Isle de France, with its talk of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Word of the Haitian Revolution had reached the island too, and that was far more alarming to the planters, because Haiti had shown that enslaved people could overthrow their masters, win their freedom, and hold it. The colonial government tried to suppress this information, but you can't keep secrets on an island where thousands of people have every reason to hope for change. By the early 1800s, Isle de France was prosperous, heavily militarized, and sitting on a powder keg. The French knew the British were coming, the British knew the French knew, and everyone knew that when the invasion finally happened, it would determine not just who controlled the island, but what kind of society would emerge from the wreckage. The clock was ticking. Chapter 4. The British arrive, slavery ends, and India comes to Mauritius. The British invasion, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Almost. There was one spectacular naval battle first, just to keep things interesting. In August of 1810, a British squadron sailed into Grand Port on the southeast coast of the island, intending to capture it and use it as a staging ground for the larger invasion. The French were waiting. What followed was the Battle of Grand Port, one of the few significant naval victories the French managed during the Napoleonic Wars, and the only British naval defeat actually commemorated on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The British lost 4 ships and hundreds of men, The French celebrated, and then, 4 months later, the British came back with an overwhelming force and took the entire island without firing a shot. The Battle of Grand Port deserves a bit more attention because it was genuinely impressive from the French perspective. The British squadron, thinking they had numerical superiority, sailed into a harbour that the French had deliberately left lightly defended as a trap. Once the British ships were inside the narrow harbour entrance, French shore batteries and warships opened fire from multiple angles. The British were boxed in. 2 of their ships ran aground trying to manoeuvre in the tight space. The battle lasted several days, with the British trying desperately to extract their vessels while the French pounded them relentlessly. By the time it was over, the British had lost 4 frigates captured or destroyed and suffered hundreds of casualties. It was a humiliating defeat for the Royal Navy, which was supposed to rule the waves. But it was also strategically meaningless, because the French didn't have the resources to follow up on the victory, and the British had plenty more ships. In December of 1810, a British fleet carrying thousands of troops appeared off the coast near Port Louis. The French looked at the numbers, did some quick math, and surrendered. There was no dramatic siege, no last stand. The French governor signed the capitulation agreement, the British flag went up, and Isle de France became Mauritius again. The whole thing was remarkably civilized, at least by early 19th century colonial warfare standards. The British even offered generous terms. The French settlers could keep their property, their language, their laws, and their Catholic religion, which was unusual. Normally, when the British conquered a French colony, they imposed English common law, the Anglican Church, and a general policy of, "You're British now, deal with it." But Mauritius was different. The British wanted cooperation, not resistance. The island was valuable as a naval base and sugar producer, and both of those things required the existing French planter class to keep running their estates. So the British made a deal. You can keep your plantations, keep your social system, keep your way of life. Just pay taxes to London instead of Paris, and don't cause trouble. The Franco-Mauritian planters accepted this arrangement enthusiastically, because it meant they got to keep the most important thing they owned, their slaves. Yes, slavery continued under British rule. This is one of those historical ironies that's almost too perfect. Britain was, at this exact moment, the world's leading abolitionist power. The British had abolished the slave trade in 1807, and there was a growing movement pushing to abolish slavery entirely across the empire. But that movement hadn't won yet, and in the meantime, the British colonial government in Mauritius was perfectly happy to let the French planters continue enslaving people, because the alternative was disrupting the sugar economy, and the sugar economy was extremely profitable. So for the next 25 years, slavery continued on British Mauritius exactly as it had under French Isle de France. Same plantations, same brutal conditions, same system of exploitation, just a different flag flying over Port Louis. The abolition movement eventually won. In 1835, slavery was abolished across the British Empire. On Mauritius, this meant that roughly 60,000 enslaved people were legally freed. Not compensated, not given land or resources or any meaningful support, just freed. The British government did pay compensation, but it went to the slave owners, not the enslaved people, which is exactly as backwards as it sounds. The Franco-Mauritian planters received substantial sums of money for the loss of their property, while the people who'd actually been enslaved received nothing but their legal freedom and the expectation that they'd figure out how to survive in an economy that was still built around sugar plantations. Many of the freed people left the plantations immediately. They moved to the cities, took up fishing, tried subsistence farming in the interior, anything to avoid going back to the fields where they'd been enslaved. the planters panicked. Who would harvest the sugar? Who would work the mills? The whole economy was built on cheap labour, and if people could refuse to work for starvation wages, the system would collapse. The planters needed a solution, and they found one. Import new workers who had no choice but to accept terrible conditions, which is how Mauritius became home to one of the largest Indian populations outside of India. The system was called indentured labour, but it was essentially slavery with a time limit and a contract you couldn't read. Starting in 1834, ships began arriving from India carrying thousands of workers, mostly from impoverished regions like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, who'd signed contracts promising them work in Mauritius. The contracts were typically for 5 years. The wages were low, the working conditions were brutal, and the workers were bound by law to complete their contracts or face criminal penalties. It was marketed as voluntary labour migration, but in practice, it was coercion dressed up in legal language. Recruiters in India lied about the conditions. Workers had no real understanding of what they were agreeing to, and once they arrived in Mauritius, they found themselves trapped in a system that looked suspiciously like the slavery system it had replaced. The voyage itself was horrific. Indian labourers were packed into ships for the journey across the Indian Ocean, which could take weeks depending on weather and winds. Conditions were cramped, sanitation was non-existent, and disease spread rapidly in the confined spaces. People died on these voyages, not in the same numbers as the Middle Passage of the Atlantic slave trade, but enough that every ship arriving in Port Louis represented not just new labour, but also new graves at sea. And when the survivors disembarked, they were immediately sent to plantations, where overseers, many of whom had overseen enslaved people just years earlier, put them to work in the cane fields under conditions that were nearly indistinguishable from slavery. Between 1834 and 1920, roughly 450,000 Indian labourers were brought to Mauritius. Think about that number. 450,000 people transported across the Indian Ocean to work on plantations owned by people who'd been slave owners a generation earlier. The demographic impact was enormous. The Indian workers, called coolies, a term that was derogatory then and is offensive now, quickly outnumbered the Creole population descended from enslaved Africans. They brought Hinduism, Islam, Indian languages, festivals, food, and an entire cultural world that would fundamentally reshape Mauritius. Not all of them left when their contracts ended. Many stayed, because they had no resources to pay for the return voyage to India, or because they'd started families in Mauritius, or because the economic situation in India was even worse than the one they'd left behind. Over time, the Indo-Mauritian community became the majority population on the island. Today, roughly 2/3 of Mauritians are of Indian descent, which is a direct legacy of this indentured labour system. The community that was brought to the island against their will or under false pretenses ended up becoming the demographic backbone of the country. But the transition wasn't smooth, and the ethnic divisions it created are still visible today. The Indo-Mauritian labourers were kept separate from the Creole population, both physically and socially. They lived in different areas, spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and occupied different positions in the economic hierarchy. The Franco-Mauritian planters remained at the top, controlling the land and the wealth. British colonial administrators ran the government, and the Indian and Creole populations were left to compete for the scraps, which created tensions that would simmer for decades and occasionally boil over into violence. The British, for their part, invested in infrastructure but not in social equality. They built a railroad in the 1860s, connecting Port Louis to the sugar-growing regions in the interior, which made it easier to transport cane to the mills and sugar to the port. They improved the harbour facilities, expanded the road network, and generally made the island more economically efficient. But they didn't address the massive inequalities baked into the system. Wealth remained concentrated in the hands of a tiny Franco-Mauritian elite. Political power remained with British colonial officials who answered to London, not to the people living on the island. And the vast majority of the population, both Indo-Mauritian and Creole, lived in poverty, working jobs that barely paid enough to survive. The sugar economy, meanwhile, was booming but fragile. Mauritius was essentially a monoculture economy, which meant that when global sugar prices were high, the island prospered, and when prices crashed, everyone suffered. And prices crashed regularly, because sugar production was expanding globally and the market was volatile. Every few decades, there'd be an economic crisis. Plantations would go bankrupt. Workers would be laid off. Families would go hungry. And then the cycle would start again when prices recovered. By the late 1800s, there were early stirrings of political organisation among the Indo-Mauritian working class. Labour unions formed, demanding better wages and working conditions. There were strikes, protests, and occasional violent confrontations between workers and plantation owners. The colonial government responded with a mix of minor concessions and heavy-handed repression. They granted limited voting rights to a small number of property-owning men, which allowed a tiny fraction of the population to participate in elections for a legislative council that had almost no real power. It was the kind of reform that looked progressive on paper but changed very little in practice. The world wars accelerated political change, as they did everywhere in the colonial world. During both World War I and World War II, thousands of Mauritians served in the British military, fighting in Europe, Africa, and Asia. They came back with new ideas about self-determination, democracy, and independence. They'd seen the wider world, fought for the British Empire, and started asking why they didn't have the same rights as British citizens in Britain. The answer, because you're colonial subjects, not citizens, was increasingly unsatisfying. After World War II, the independence movement gained momentum. In 1947, Mauritius got a new constitution that established a more representative government, though real power still rested with the British governor. Political parties formed, mostly along ethnic lines. The Labour Party, led by a doctor named Seewoosagur Ramgoolam, drew support from the Indo-Mauritian majority. Other parties represented Franco-Mauritian interests, Creole communities, and various other factions. The debates were intense and often bitter, because everyone understood that independence would determine who controlled the island's future. The ethnic tensions were real and serious. The Franco-Mauritian minority worried that independence would mean losing their economic power to an Indo-Mauritian majority. The Creole population worried about being marginalized between the wealthy Franco-Mauritians and the numerically dominant Indo-Mauritians. The Indo-Mauritian community was itself divided between Hindus and Muslims, between labourers and merchants, between different regions and castes. And the British were trying to manage all of this while gradually preparing to leave, which meant everyone was jockeying for position in whatever post-independence system would emerge. By the 1960s, independence was inevitable. The question was no longer if, but when and how. The old colonial order was dying. The sugar economy was still functioning but showing its age. And a new generation of Mauritian leaders was preparing to take control of their own country. For the first time in its history, Mauritius would be governed by people who actually lived there. Chapter 5: Independence, Economic Miracles, and Unfinished Business. On March 12, 1968, Mauritius became an independent nation. Seewoosagur Ramgoolam, the doctor who'd led the independence movement, became the country's first prime minister. The British flag came down. The new Mauritian flag, red, blue, yellow and green stripes representing the island's diversity, went up. There were celebrations in Port Louis, speeches about freedom and self-determination, and a general sense that the island was finally in control of its own destiny, which was true, but it was also terrifying, because now all the problems that had been blamed on colonial rule were Mauritius's problems to solve, and those problems were substantial. The vote for independence had been close, closer than anyone wanted to admit. The Indo-Mauritian majority largely supported it, seeing independence as a chance to finally have political power proportional to their numbers. But many in the Creole community opposed it, fearing that independence would mean domination by the Hindu majority and further marginalization for descendants of enslaved Africans who'd never gotten their fair share under either French or British rule. The Franco-Mauritian elite was nervous too, though for different reasons. They worried about losing their economic privileges in a system where they'd no longer have British protection. The fact that independence happened at all was a testament to Ramgoolam's political skill and the general sense that colonialism had run its course. The early years were rough. The economy was still overwhelmingly dependent on sugar, which meant that when global sugar prices fluctuated, the entire country felt it. Unemployment was high, especially among young people who were entering a job market that had almost nothing to offer them. The population was growing rapidly. Mauritius had one of the highest birth rates in the world at the time, which put pressure on schools, housing, and infrastructure. And the ethnic tensions that had simmered during the colonial period didn't magically disappear just because the British had left. If anything, they got worse, because now there was no external authority to blame. These were Mauritian problems, and Mauritians had to figure out how to solve them. International observers were skeptical about the island's prospects. A small island nation with limited natural resources, no manufacturing base, a population split along ethnic and linguistic lines, and an economy built entirely on a single agricultural commodity, it didn't look promising. Some economists predicted that Mauritius would become dependent on foreign aid. Others thought ethnic conflict would tear the country apart. The fact that neither of those things happened is what makes the subsequent decades so interesting. What happened next is often called the Mauritius Miracle, and while that's a bit hyperbolic, it's not entirely wrong. Over the next 3 decades, Mauritius transformed itself from a poor, sugar-dependent island into one of the most prosperous and stable countries in Africa. The transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because the government made deliberate policy choices that, against all odds, actually worked. The first major move was diversification. The government realized that relying on sugar was economic suicide. Global prices were volatile, trade preferences were uncertain, and the industry employed fewer people every year as mechanization increased. So they decided to build new industries from scratch. In the 1970s, they established export processing zones, essentially free trade areas where foreign companies could set up factories, import materials duty-free, and export finished goods without paying taxes. The idea was to attract textile and garment manufacturers who needed cheap labor and wanted to avoid trade barriers. It worked. Companies from Hong Kong, France, and elsewhere set up factories in Mauritius, hired thousands of workers, and turned the island into a major textile exporter. The transformation happened fast. Within a decade, there were textile factories across the island, employing primarily young women who'd previously had limited employment options beyond domestic work or subsistence farming. The factories produced clothing for European and American markets, shirts, pants, dresses, all stamped "Made in Mauritius," and shipped thousands of kilometres to department stores in Paris and London. The wages were low by international standards but higher than anything available in agriculture, which drew workers from rural areas into urban and peri-urban factory zones. Entire families restructured their lives around factory shifts. Women who'd never earned independent incomes suddenly had money of their own, which changed household dynamics and gave them a degree of economic autonomy their mothers and grandmothers never had. The textile boom created jobs, but it also created problems. The work was grueling and low paid, mostly done by women who worked long hours in hot factories for wages that were better than nothing but not by much. Labour activists pushed for better conditions. There were strikes. The government tried to balance attracting foreign investment with protecting workers, which is a tightrope walk that never gets easier. But the textile sector grew anyway, and by the 1980s it was a major part of the economy, employing tens of thousands of people and bringing in foreign currency. Tourism was the second pillar of the economic transformation. Mauritius had always been beautiful. The lagoons, the beaches, the tropical climate, but beauty doesn't automatically translate into tourist dollars. You need infrastructure. You need hotels, airports, roads, and a reputation. The government invested heavily in all of it. They marketed Mauritius as a luxury destination, targeting wealthy Europeans looking for pristine beaches and five-star resorts. They built high-end hotels along the coast, upgraded the airport, and made it easy for tourists to get visas and spend money. It worked spectacularly. By the 1990s, tourism was bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and the industry employed a significant chunk of the workforce. The third pillar, which emerged in the 1980s and 90s, was financial services. Mauritius positioned itself as a hub for international banking and investment, particularly for companies doing business between Africa and Asia. They created favourable tax laws, built modern telecommunications infrastructure, and sold themselves as a stable, English-speaking, well-regulated jurisdiction where companies could base their regional operations. It was the same strategy that places like Singapore and Dubai had used, and it worked. Banks, insurance companies, and investment firms set up offices in Port Louis. The financial sector became a major employer and revenue source. The economic growth was real and impressive. GDP per capita rose steadily, poverty rates fell, literacy rates climbed to over 90% as the government invested in free education. Healthcare improved. Infrastructure got better. By the 2000s, Mauritius had one of the highest standards of living in Africa and was regularly cited as a development success story. Economists studied it. International organizations praised it. The Mauritius Miracle became a case study in how small island nations could succeed against long odds. But, and there's always a but, the miracle had limits. The economic growth didn't erase the inequalities baked into Mauritian society. The Franco-Mauritian elite, despite being a tiny fraction of the population, still controlled a disproportionate share of the land and wealth. The big sugar estates, the luxury hotels, the major businesses, they were still largely owned by the same families who'd owned them under colonial rule. They'd adapted to independence brilliantly, diversifying their investments and maintaining their economic dominance, even as political power shifted to the Indo-Mauritian majority. The Creole community, meanwhile, remained largely excluded from the prosperity. Descended from enslaved Africans and constituting roughly a quarter of the population, Creoles faced persistent discrimination in employment, education, and housing. They were overrepresented among the poor and underrepresented in positions of power. And while the government occasionally made gestures toward addressing this inequality, the political system itself worked against meaningful change. Because elections were largely decided by the Indo-Mauritian majority, and Creole concerns were easy to ignore if they weren't electorally decisive. This frustration exploded into violence in 1999. A popular Creole musician named Kaya, basically the Bob Marley of Mauritius, was arrested for smoking cannabis at a concert advocating for drug law reform. 3 days later, he died in police custody under suspicious circumstances. The official story was that he'd killed himself. Almost no one believed it. Riots erupted in Port Louis and other cities. Creole youth took to the streets, burning cars, smashing windows and clashing with police. The government imposed a curfew and cracked down hard. Several people were killed. Hundreds were arrested. And when the dust settled, the underlying issues, police brutality, economic marginalization, systemic discrimination, remained largely unaddressed. Politically, Mauritius maintained a multi-party democracy, which was remarkable given that most post-colonial African states had descended into dictatorship or chaos. Power alternated between parties relatively peacefully. Elections were generally free and fair. The press was mostly free. Civil liberties were respected, at least compared to regional neighbours. In 1992, Mauritius became a republic, replacing the British Queen as head of state with a ceremonial president. The first president was Kassam Utim, a Muslim of Indian descent, which was symbolically significant in a country still navigating ethnic divisions. The Ramgoolam family remained a political dynasty. Seewoosagur Ramgoolam, the founding prime minister, died in 1985, but his son Navin eventually entered politics and served as prime minister multiple times. Another major political figure was Anirudh Jugnauth, who served as prime minister for much of the 1980s and 90s, presiding over much of the economic transformation. Politics in Mauritius was stable but also somewhat dynastic, with the same families and networks circulating through power. Ethnicity remained the dominant organizing principle in politics. Parties drew support along ethnic lines. The Hindu majority often decided elections. Muslims, Creoles and Franco-Mauritians formed smaller but significant voting blocs. Coalition governments were common because no single party could usually win an outright majority, which meant backroom deals and ethnic horse trading. It wasn't pretty, but it mostly worked. The system was messy and imperfect, but it was functional, which put Mauritius ahead of many of its neighbours. By the 2000s, the island faced new challenges. The sugar industry was in terminal decline. Global prices had fallen, and the European Union was phasing out the preferential trade arrangements that had kept Mauritian sugar competitive. Sugar estates were closing or converting to other uses. The textile industry was also struggling, facing fierce competition from Bangladesh, Vietnam, and other countries with even lower labour costs. The economic model that had fueled the miracle was running out of steam. Tourism and financial services remained strong, but they created their own problems. Coastal development was destroying the reefs and beaches that tourists came to see. Port Louis was choking on traffic. Housing costs were rising faster than incomes. Youth unemployment remained stubbornly high, even as the overall economy grew, and there was a growing sense that the benefits of growth were concentrating at the top, among the same elite families who'd always controlled the island's wealth. Environmental challenges loomed larger. Mauritius is a small island with limited land and resources. Every development decision involved trade-offs. Build more hotels, and you threaten the ecosystem. Expand agriculture, and you put pressure on water supplies. Grow the population, and you strain infrastructure. The government tried to balance growth with sustainability, but it was a difficult balancing act, and they didn't always get it right. Despite all this, Mauritius remained one of Africa's success stories. It had avoided the civil wars, coups, and economic collapses that plagued so many post-colonial states. It had maintained democracy. It had diversified its economy. It had built a functioning welfare state with free education and healthcare. Life expectancy was in the 70s. Literacy was over 90%. The average Mauritian in the year 2000 was far better off than the average Mauritian in 1968. But the unfinished business was impossible to ignore. The ethnic divisions, the economic inequality, the environmental degradation, the decline of traditional industries without clear replacements. These were the challenges the island would carry into the 21st century. Chapter 6. The 21st Century Paradise Under Pressure. So here we are in the 21st century, and Mauritius is still here, which is worth noting given how many people predicted it wouldn't make it this far. The island is now home to about 1.3 million people. It's classified as an upper middle income country, and it has one of the highest Human Development Index scores in Africa. Life expectancy is in the mid-70s. Literacy is over 90%. Democracy is functioning, more or less. By most objective measures, Mauritius has succeeded beyond what anyone expected when independence happened 50-some years ago. But success creates its own problems, and the island is navigating some serious challenges that could determine whether the next 50 years look like progress or decline. Let's start with politics, because that's where the cracks are most visible. The political system remains dominated by the same families who've been running things since independence. The Ramgoolam family, the Jugnauth family. They keep cycling through power, passing leadership positions between themselves like a family business. Navin Ramgoolam, son of the first Prime Minister, has served as Prime Minister multiple times. Anirudh Jugnauth, who first became Prime Minister in the 1980s, returned to the position in 2014 at the age of 84, which is impressive in a refusing to retire kind of way. In 2017, he handed the job to his son, Pravind Jugnauth, who's still Prime Minister as of this writing. It's democracy, technically, because there are elections and opposition parties and peaceful transfers of power, but it's also dynasty politics, which creates a sense that real power is circulating within a closed elite, rather than being genuinely contestable. Corruption is a persistent problem, not at the levels you see in some neighbouring countries, but enough to erode trust in government. There have been scandals involving government contracts, financial improprieties and allegations of political interference in law enforcement and the judiciary. Press freedom has declined slightly, with journalists facing harassment and legal threats when they investigate sensitive topics. Democracy in Mauritius is real, but it's under pressure, and the trajectory is concerning. It's a reminder that democratic backsliding can happen even in countries that seem to have it figured out. Economically, the island is trying to maintain the growth that fueled the miracle while adapting to a changing global environment. Tourism remains huge. Those pristine beaches and luxury resorts that were marketed so aggressively in the 1980s and 90s are still drawing visitors, particularly from Europe, South Africa, and increasingly from China and India. The island welcomed over 1 million tourists annually in the years before COVID, which is almost as many people as actually live there. The economic impact was enormous. Hotels, restaurants, tour operators, all the associated services that tourism generates. And then COVID happened. In 2020, the borders closed. Tourism stopped. The hotels sat empty. Tens of thousands of people lost their jobs overnight. The government provided bailouts and stimulus packages, trying to keep the economy from collapsing entirely. But the damage was severe. Mauritius went from being one of Africa's success stories to being one of the hardest hit economies in the region, purely because it had bet so heavily on tourism. The recovery has been slow. Tourists are coming back, but the pandemic exposed just how vulnerable the island is to external shocks, when your entire economy depends on people choosing to vacation on your beaches. The pandemic hit different parts of Mauritian society differently, as pandemics tend to do. The wealthy Franco-Mauritian families with diversified investments weathered it relatively well. The middle-class hotel workers, tour guides and restaurant staff were devastated. The government's support programs helped, but they couldn't replace lost income entirely, and many people burned through their savings just to survive the lockdowns. The informal economy, street vendors, small businesses, casual labourers got hit hardest of all because they had no safety net and limited access to government assistance. It was a stark reminder that economic growth doesn't automatically mean economic security, especially when that growth is concentrated in sectors vulnerable to global crises. Financial services continue to be a major sector, though the island's reputation as an offshore financial centre has attracted some unwanted attention. Critics call it a tax haven, arguing that Mauritius allows multinational corporations to funnel profits through shell companies to avoid taxes in other countries. The government pushes back, saying they're just offering competitive tax rates and good infrastructure, which is what any smart country does. The debate gets into technical questions about international tax law and economic development that don't have easy answers. What's clear is that financial services bring in significant revenue and high-paying jobs, but they also create reputational risks and dependence on global financial flows that can shift unpredictably. The government has tried to diversify further into technology and ICT, positioning Mauritius as a tech hub for the Indian Ocean region. They've built fibre optic cables connecting to Africa and Asia. They've created tax incentives for tech companies. They're marketing Port Louis as a place where startups and digital companies can base their regional operations. It's a sensible strategy, and it's had some success. But Mauritius is competing with much larger countries that have more resources and bigger markets. It's hard to become Singapore when you're a small island nation with limited infrastructure and a small domestic market. Real estate development has become another growth sector, particularly luxury properties marketed to wealthy foreigners. The government allows non-citizens to buy property under certain schemes, which has led to a boom in high-end villas and gated communities along the coast. This brings in foreign investment and creates construction jobs, but it also drives up property prices, making housing less affordable for ordinary Mauritians. And it accelerates coastal development, which brings us to the environmental problems. Climate change is an existential threat for Mauritius. This is not hyperbole. The island is small, low-lying in parts, and surrounded by reefs that are already under severe stress from warming ocean temperatures and acidification. Sea level rise is happening. Coastal erosion is accelerating. Cyclones are getting stronger and more frequent. The reefs, which protect the island from storm surges and support the fishing industry and tourism, are bleaching and dying. If the reefs collapse, the island loses its natural defences against the ocean and large parts of the coast become uninhabitable. And then there was the MV Wakashio disaster. In July 2020, a Japanese bulk carrier ran aground on a reef off the southeast coast of Mauritius. The ship sat there for 2 weeks before it started breaking apart and leaking fuel oil into the pristine lagoon. Over 1,000 tons of oil spilled into the water, coating beaches, killing marine life, and devastating the local ecosystem. It was the worst environmental disaster in Mauritius's history. Volunteers showed up by the thousands to help with the cleanup, making booms out of sugarcane leaves and human hair to absorb the oil. The government's response was slow and inadequate. The shipping company paid compensation, but the ecological damage will take years or decades to repair. And the whole incident highlighted how vulnerable the island is to accidents and disasters that it has no control over. Freshwater is another growing problem. Mauritius has no major rivers and limited groundwater. The island relies on rainfall and reservoirs. and climate change is making rainfall patterns less predictable. Droughts are becoming more common. Water rationing has been necessary in some areas. The government is investing in desalination plants, but those are expensive and energy intensive. For a small island nation, water security is a serious concern. Socially, the island is dealing with issues that sound familiar if you've been paying attention to global trends. There's a drug problem, particularly synthetic drugs like heroin and methamphetamine, which have hit the younger generation hard. Crime rates have risen in some areas, though Mauritius is still safer than many of its neighbours. Youth unemployment remains stubbornly high, even though the overall economy is growing, which creates frustration and a sense that the economic opportunities are concentrating among the already privileged. Brain drain as real educated young Mauritians are emigrating to Australia, Canada, Europe, looking for opportunities that don't exist at home. Ethnic inequality persists. The Franco-Mauritian minority still controls a disproportionate share of the wealth. The Creole community remains economically marginalized. The Indo-Mauritian majority is itself stratified between wealthy business owners and poor laborers. Ethnic politics still dominates elections. There's been progress in creating a shared Mauritian identity. The Creole language is increasingly used as a common tongue across ethnic groups, and there's a growing sense of shared national identity, but the divisions are deep and won't disappear quickly. Gender-based violence is an issue the country is starting to grapple with publicly. Domestic violence rates are high, and women's rights organisations have been pushing for stronger legal protections and better enforcement. The government has made some reforms, but cultural attitudes change slowly, and enforcement remains inconsistent. There's also the Chagos archipelago dispute, which is a bizarre geopolitical footnote that's actually quite important. Mauritius claims sovereignty over the Chagos Islands, which are located about 2,000 kilometres northeast of the main island. Britain has controlled Chagos since the colonial period and allowed the United States to build a massive military base on Diego Garcia, the largest island in the chain. In the 1960s and 70s, Britain forcibly removed the Chagosian people from the islands to make way for the base, which is one of those historical atrocities that doesn't get talked about enough. Mauritius has been demanding the return of Chagos for decades. In 2019, the International Court of Justice ruled that Britain's continued administration of the islands is illegal and that they should be returned to Mauritius. Britain and the United States have ignored this ruling because Diego Garcia is strategically valuable and they have the power to ignore international law when it's inconvenient. The dispute continues. Despite all these challenges, Mauritius has genuine achievements to point to. It's a functioning democracy in a region where democracies are rare and fragile. It has maintained political stability and avoided the civil conflicts that have torn apart so many other post-colonial states. It has a social safety net, free education, and universal healthcare, which is more than most countries in Africa can claim. The middle class has grown significantly across all ethnic groups. People live longer, healthier lives than they did a generation ago. The island has also become genuinely multicultural in a way that works, more or less. Hindu temples, mosques, Catholic churches, and Chinese pagodas coexist within walking distance of each other. Festivals from different religious traditions are celebrated publicly. It's not perfect, ethnic tensions are real, but compared to many places where diversity leads to conflict, Mauritius has managed to make multiculturalism functional. Looking forward, the big questions are about sustainability and resilience. Can the island continue to grow economically while protecting the environment that makes it livable? Can it diversify enough to avoid being devastated by the next global crisis, whether that's a pandemic, an economic crash, or a climate disaster? Can it reduce inequality enough to prevent social instability? Can it maintain democracy while resisting the global trend toward authoritarianism? The island that was uninhabited until Europeans showed up, that drove the dodo to extinction, that was built on slavery and indentured labour, that survived colonialism and emerged as one of Africa's few democratic success stories. That island is now trying to navigate the 21st century with all its complexity and challenges. It's doing better than most people expected, but the future is uncertain and the margin for error is small. Mauritius is a small island in a big ocean, facing big problems. It's beautiful, complicated, unequal, resilient, and perpetually at risk, which, honestly, is a pretty good summary of human civilization in general. Thanks for listening. Sweet dreams.